Today we have with us, we've done over the years many Lincoln programs, but at no time could I ever say that we have the greatest living Lincoln scholar in the museum today. And Professor Michael Burlingame, many of you have probably heard of the great Civil War historian James McPherson out of Princeton. He says that no one knows more about Lincoln, no other living person today knows more about Abraham Lincoln than Professor Michael Burlingame. In fact, many people say that. And Professor Michael Burlingame started his career differently. A lot of times someone in the Lincoln world will decide, well, I want to write a book. But they're not going to have 10 or 20 years. They didn't have 10 or 20 years to go back into the archives and get their hands dirty and look at all the old diaries and letters and the collected works and the writings. That's what Professor Michael Burlingame did for so many years. And that's why his work is so good and why it's so important today. He is the chair, the Naomi B. Lynn Distinguished Chair in Lincoln Studies at the University of Illinois in Springfield. But he was born in Washington, D.C. He graduated from Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts in 1960. He studied at Princeton University, where he was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow and a Fulbright Scholar. He graduated from Princeton in 1964 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. He earned his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University in 1971. And throughout his long career, Professor Burlingame has received numerous awards. He was inducted into the Lincoln Academy of Illinois in 2009. That is the highest award that the state of Illinois will give anyone. It's very rare and difficult to be inducted into that, but for all of his good work, he achieved that standing. I believe when Jim McPherson says, no one alive knows more about Abraham Lincoln than Professor Michael Burlingame. And when Time magazine writes that into their publication, you have to take all this seriously. And then I look at what Lincoln scholars say, and they say basically the same thing. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you today what I would say is the greatest living Lincoln scholar in America, Professor Michael Burlingame. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to speak to a live audience for the first time in over a year and a half. Zoom has its uses, but nothing compares to having a live audience. So I'm very grateful to be invited and very grateful to you for coming. So, and also to be able to speak in this room, my goodness, the images of Lincoln, the artifacts, the busts, the sculptures, make this an extremely congenial spot for a Lincoln scholar to hold forth. And the only place that I can think of where I felt more congenial was the old state capitol in Springfield, where Lincoln delivered the House Divided speech. It's really a thrill to get up in there and stand in that very spot. So Joe, thank you again for that very generous introduction. I'm reminded of a story about Lyndon Johnson when he became the Senate Majority Leader back in the 1950s. And he was in his enormous office behind his huge desk, and a freshman Democratic senator came in and had a request to make, but he prefaced his request by showering compliments on Johnson. And Johnson bathed in this, and when the junior senator was finally through with the compliments, Johnson said to him, "Why, Senator, I just wish my parents could have been here to listen to you. My father would have enjoyed it, and my mother would have believed it." And I'm glad to be back in this neck of the woods. I spent a great deal of time in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, not too far from here, many years ago. And it's good to be back in this neck of the woods, and particularly on such a beautiful day. So, Joe said that you're a very serious audience, and that I shouldn't feel as though I should rush through a presentation. And so I will start off by saying, apropos of this book, Abraham Lincoln, A Life, be sure to buy it. You don't have to read it, but be sure to buy it. And I've been told that producing this book is the closest equivalent that I would ever conceivably experience that's analogous to childbirth. And I said, well, 11 years is a pretty long gestation period. But the final result weighs 9 pounds, so it's more or less the same. And I call it the Green Monster because those of you who are baseball fans will doubtless recognize that as an allusion to the left field wall at Fenway Park, the home of the Boston Red Sox. But I like to think that when the sportscasters and sports writers in New England refer to the Green Monster, they're actually plugging my book. So, and you may wonder, what in the world justifies, in this day and age, a 2,000-page biography of Lincoln? Hasn't everything important ever been recorded and written up by an army of previous scholars? And I must say, I felt that way when I started my Lincoln research many years ago. My first book was called The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln. It's a series of psychological essays about his relations with his parents, with his children, with his wife, his midlife crisis, his depression, all that sort of thing. I'm something of a psychohistorian. That, by the way, is one word. There are psychohistorians, 2 words, but I flatter myself that I don't fall into that category, although not everybody I know would necessarily agree with that. And when I wrote that book, I was teaching at Connecticut College in New London, which I began teaching at in 1968 when it was called Connecticut College for Women. It went co-ed the following year and changed its name to just Connecticut College. But I'm told that the female undergraduates there refer to it informally among themselves as Connecticut College for Women and Boys. I'm not necessarily vouching for the accuracy of that description necessarily, but only that it is so referred to. Anyhow, so New London, Connecticut is not the ideal place to conduct Lincoln research. But I thought, what I can do in New London is consult all the published material, books and articles, not only at the college library, but also through interlibrary loan, and go over the well-trodden ground, but offer a fresh perspective. Look at the familiar material from a new angle. And so I drafted the book based on printed sources, and then I thought, well, I really should do some research in unpublished sources. And so I went to Brown University, which is about an hour away from New London in Providence, Rhode Island. And it's a great place to do Lincoln research. If you can't be in Springfield or Washington, Brown is really an ideal place to be because it has a tremendous Lincoln library, because John Hay, Lincoln's assistant personal secretary in the White House, left his papers there. And then John D. Rockefeller Jr. supplemented the Hay collection with one of the big 5 Lincoln collections that he bought and donated to Brown. So, and they have lovingly cataloged and preserved the material. And so the very first day that I go out to do original research in unpublished sources, I go to Brown and I have a very sophisticated research design. I went to the card catalog. Some of you, I think, are old enough to remember what a card catalog is. And I very thoughtfully went to the drawer marked L and pulled it out. And there were lots and lots of little 3x5 cards indicating books and pamphlets. But then there are a whole bunch of 3x5 cards indicating manuscripts, unpublished manuscripts. And there were interviews that Hay and Nicolay, his fellow White House secretary during the Lincoln administration, interviews that they had conducted with people who knew Lincoln. And of course I had read a lot of stuff ahead of time, and so I knew, I could see the summaries of these interviews, and I thought, holy mackerel, this is interesting stuff. And I went through it, and then the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. And I then published that as my second book, all of these interviews. And I said to the librarians at Brown, I said, you've done a magnificent job of preserving this material and making it available. But I never see this material quoted and cited. And they said, well, what can I tell you? Abraham Lincoln is a dead white male. I said, I knew that. And it's very unfashionable to write about dead white males if you want to get ahead in the history world and the modern academy. You might want to write on a subject like homosexuality among 19th century Chinese pirates. I'm not making this up, that's a serious topic. And I said, well, what can I tell you? I'm interested in Abraham Lincoln, that's what I'm going to pursue. So then, as Joe mentioned, I published these interviews, and then I published John Hay's diary, which had been very inadequately published earlier. And then I dug up John Hay's journalism. People never knew that he wrote this journalism, but I discovered his papers. And I edited several volumes of primary source materials. And then I thought to myself, somebody ought to take all this material and do a new cradle-to-grave detailed biography. And I looked around and thought maybe Jim McPherson would do it, or Gabor Borid, or any number of people, and nobody wanted to do it. So I said, well, what the heck, in for a penny, in for a pound. And so I went ahead and did it. So that's how this came about. And then now the two books before you today, there's the two recent ones that appeared this year, are spin-offs of that larger enterprise, more detailed, based on more material, because what has happened since this appeared back in 2009 is that there's been an exponential explosion of newspapers that are word searchable online. And everything I've written needs to be updated now, because now we can go to these newspaper databases at Ancestry.com or at newspapers.com, and it's like having giant magnets, and they draw all these needles out of the haystack. And so there's an awful lot of new information in the marriage book and in the book on Lincoln and African Americans. Now, one of the things that impelled me to do the book on Lincoln and African Americans is a speech I discovered that Frederick Douglass had given on June 1st, 1865, 6 weeks after Lincoln's assassination. And it's in the Frederick Douglass Papers, the Library of Congress, in his handwriting. And it was written up in it was given in New York at Cooper Union, the premier place to give a public speech in those days. Written up in the New York Times, the New York Herald, the New York Tribune. But when I looked at it, I couldn't believe it. It said, Douglass in this eulogy for Lincoln, said Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. And I said, holy mackerel. Because everybody who writes about Lincoln and race cites a speech that Douglass delivered 11 years later at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. And in that speech, which is very widely known, Frederick Douglass said Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. And we black people were only his stepchildren. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, how could this be? And I thought I had looked up all the published editions of Frederick Douglass's speeches. Yale Press had published 5 big fat volumes. Their volumes are fat, mine are magisterial. So I raced back to the library and went to June 1st, 1865, and I didn't find it. I thought, now wait a minute, how could that be? And so I wrote to the people at Yale and said, well, why didn't you include this remarkable speech that Douglass gives on June 1st, 1865, which is so different from the speech that everybody knows in 1876, and didn't get any response. So I called and left a message, no response. Well, those of us who went to Princeton aren't surprised that Yale would conduct itself in this fashion, but what can I tell you? And so I thought, this whole approach to Lincoln and race needs to be framed by that speech. And I thought the best way to investigate Lincoln's attitude toward race was not to look once again at the speeches and correspondence and other writings, which were familiar, but Lincoln's interaction with black people. How he dealt with black people in Springfield, how he dealt with them in Washington, how he treated them, how they responded to his presence and his treatment of them. Thanks to these newspaper databases, there's a lot of information that previously had been almost inaccessible was now accessible. And what I'd like to do now is, in formal remarks, share with you some of the findings that I've made in this book to give you an idea of what it's all about. Now, getting back to that June 1st, 1865 speech, in addition to saying that Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president, Douglas goes on to say that Lincoln was the first to show any respect for the rights of a black man, or to acknowledge that he had any rights that the white man ought to respect. That he was the first president to rise above the prejudice of his times and his country. Lincoln, according to Frederick Douglass in that speech, said, Lincoln treated each African American not as a patron, but as an equal. That is, he wasn't patronizing. Now, speaking of his own experience, Douglass concluded, in daring to admit, nay, in daring to invite a Negro to an audience at the White House, Mr. Lincoln did that which he knew would be offensive to the crowd and excite their ribaldry, their contempt. It was saying, by that action, to the country, I am the president of the black people as well as the white, and I mean to respect their rights and feelings as men and citizens. Now, the theory I'm working on in this book is a variation on that familiar adage that actions speak louder than words. But I thought that when it comes to analyzing Abraham Lincoln's views on race, his interactions speak louder than anything he said or wrote. And in my new book, I examine those interactions both in Springfield and Washington and conclude that they reveal him to be instinctively a racial egalitarian. His unfailing cordiality to black people, his willingness to meet with them in the White House, to honor their requests, to invite them to consult on public policy, to treat them with respect and kindness, whether they were kitchen servants or leaders of the black community in the district, to invite them to White House receptions and to tea, to sing and pray with them on their turf, to authorize them to hold events on White House grounds. All of these manifestations of an egalitarian spirit fully justified the tributes paid to him by several African Americans in addition to Frederick Douglass. For example, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth came to call in the White House to thank the president for the emancipation policies that he had adopted. And she said shortly thereafter that she had never been treated more kindly by anyone than she was by that great and good man, Abraham Lincoln. Elizabeth Keckley, who was Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, who was in the White House through many of the days of the Lincoln administration, and saw the Lincolns interact and was kindly treated by him and gave similar praise to Lincoln for his kindness, and said that he never treated blacks on the White House staff with anything like condescension. He treated them just as well and just as cordially and openly as he did the white staff. Let me give you some examples of the kinds of interactions that inspired this kind of judgment. Now, in Springfield, It used to be said that if you want to understand Lincoln's racial views, you should recall and bear in mind that in Springfield, there were no blacks like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and people that he met in Washington. That the kind of people he met in Washington were more educated, more sophisticated, more articulate, and that the black folks in Springfield were few in number, and that insofar as Lincoln interacted with them, he never really ran into people who were particularly articulate or self-respecting or assertive or the like. And that was accepted gospel. And then when Lincoln gets to Washington, then his attitude toward black people changes because he meets people like Frederick Douglass and other educated, sophisticated, articulate spokespeople, black and white, that is male and female. And so that's the old interpretation. Well, in fact, a scholar and lawyer in Springfield named Richard Hart, years ago, did extensive research in Springfield. He's based in Springfield, and he's an authority on Springfield and Lincoln's time. And so Richard Hart has published and self-published a large number of works on Lincoln in his interaction with blacks. And so I rely very heavily on what Attorney Hart has come up with. And here are some examples. First thing to bear in mind is that the Lincolns lived in a racially mixed neighborhood. That black people lived just 2 or 3 doors down the street from Lincoln. Jameson Jenkins, for example. And Jameson Jenkins was a delivery man, a carter. And his, I'll get it. And he was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad, which took a lot, that's very courageous to help spirit fugitive slaves on the way to freedom. And then there were others living nearby. James Blanks. James Blanks was very assertive. One of the things that he championed was education for black children. He launched a campaign to establish black schools in Springfield, which was actually done at his insistence with the help of many other blacks. Lincoln's bootmaker, William Donovan, was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So here are people that Lincoln knows who are not passive, acquiescent, but self-respecting and assertive black people who championed the cause of black freedom and of black education and the like. Another thing to bear in mind is that many of the servants in the Lincoln home were African Americans. For example, there was a gentleman named Henry Brown who led Lincoln's horse in the funeral procession from downtown Springfield out to Oak Ridge Cemetery. It was very close to Lincoln. And Henry Brown also was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And he was also a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And that he took that up while he was still working at the Lincoln home, and Lincoln encouraged him in his studies to become a minister. Another black person who served in the Lincoln home was a young man in his 20s named William H. Johnson. And Lincoln took William H. Johnson with him to Washington when he moved from Springfield to the district in 1861. And he had been working at the Lincoln home for about a year. And Lincoln wanted to employ him at the White House as a body servant, in effect, a valet, and also have some other duties as a messenger or a porter. But he was dark-skinned, and the African Americans on the White House staff were all light-skinned, and they practically rebelled against the idea of having a dark-skinned employee in the White House staff. So Lincoln then scrambled to find him a job in another agency and got him a job at the Treasury Department. And as you may know, the Treasury Department is very close to the White House, so he would work some time at the White House and then some time at the Treasury Department. And Lincoln was very fond of him. And when he went to buy a house, that is, William H. Johnson wanted to buy a house, he took out a loan from the bank in D.C. And Lincoln guaranteed the loan. And then Johnson goes with Lincoln to Gettysburg on November 19th, or 18th they went up. And when they came back to Washington, both of them had smallpox. Lincoln had a very mild case called varioloid, which sidelined him for 3 weeks. And he was warned that he was very contagious. And Lincoln said, "Oh, good." He said, "Now I've got something I can give everyone." And anyhow, and then Lincoln was told that his smallpox might develop scars and scabs, and he said, "Well, at least he couldn't disfigure me. So, I'm already pretty ugly." But it killed, William H. Johnson died. His case of smallpox was serious, okay, and lethal. And while he was in his hospital bed, Lincoln was one day discovered by a journalist sitting down and writing out checks and putting them in envelopes. And this correspondent said, "Mr. President, what are you up to?" And he said, "Well, there are a lot of duties that a president has to perform that aren't specified in the Constitution or in the statutes of Congress. Poor William is now sick in the hospital, and he can't sign his name, and so I'm doing this for him to help him get his pay." And then Johnson dies. And Lincoln happens to be speaking with a banker, and the banker says, "Well, you know, he still owed us some money from that loan that you guaranteed." And he said, "Well, I'll pay it off." And the banker says, "No, no, no." He says, "We have charity, and we'll just write this up to charity." No, Lincoln says, I insist. You know, I purchased a coffin for poor William, and I've helped his family, and I want to pay off this mortgage. And the banker said, "Well, look, you took a risk in signing it, and we took a risk in extending the loan, so we'll split it 50-50. And Lincoln said, "Well, no, you've got to include the interest payment too." So the banker said, "Well, you endorse the Negro?" And he says, "I do, and I'm not afraid to admit it." Other black people in Springfield that Lincoln knew included clients. Lincoln was a lawyer, and some, but not many, black people were clients of his. And one of them was a woman named Mary Shelby. And she applied for a divorce, and Lincoln helped her obtain that divorce. And then 15 years later, her son was in New Orleans. He was a member of a crew on a steamboat, and he had gotten off the steamboat but didn't have his free papers with him. And he was arrested, and he couldn't prove that he was free, and so he was going to be jailed and then auctioned off. Whoa! And Lincoln finds out about this, and he goes ballistic. Goes to the governor of Illinois and says, "You got to do something about this." And the governor says, "My hands are tied." "Well, I'll go to the governor of Louisiana." No, his hands are tied. So Lincoln eventually then raises money, including some of his own, hires a lawyer, and then facilitates the escape of young Shelby. Then another client of his was William Flourville. William Flourville was the closest friend that Lincoln had in the black community. He was his barber, but he was a lot more than just a barber. He was a very successful businessman. He established a dry cleaning business, he invested in real estate, he became quite well-to-do by the standards of the time, and was very philanthropic, and was a remarkable musician. He played several instruments. So this is a remarkable guy. And Lincoln helped him when he was given land in payment for some services. Lincoln helped him secure the title to the land. It was in nearby Bloomington. And also paid the taxes, made sure that the taxes got paid. But the quality of their relationship went far beyond a lawyer and a client. And the reason we know that is because William Flourville writes a letter to Lincoln in 1863 in response to Lincoln's greetings that had been conveyed by a friend or two friends of Lincoln's who had come from Washington to Springfield, and they looked Flourville up and said, "Look, the president sends his warmest greetings, hopes you're doing well." And so then Flourville responds with this very long and very touching letter. Among other things, he expresses condolences for the death of Lincoln's son, Willie, who died a little less than a year into Lincoln's administration. It was a terrible blow for Lincoln. Willie was the favorite child, the child who was just like Lincoln, who had his temperament, his humor, his way of looking at the world. And so Flourville writes this letter in which he says some very kind and generous things about Willie. He said he was so far advanced for a boy of his young years. He was really a remarkable young man. And then he goes on to say, explain what's happening in his life. Then he also explains what's happening to Lincoln's dog, Fido. Lincoln wasn't very imaginative when it came to naming pets. We had a cat named Tabby and a dog named Fido. But Fido's doing well. And by the way, the people who have sublet your house are keeping it in good shape because they don't have children to ruin things. That's his exact phrase. So anyway, the feeling tone of this long letter is one of real warmth and friendship and concern, not of client and attorney or barber and customer, but of people who care about each other, care deeply about each other. And when Lincoln dies, Flourville was invited to help lead the procession, but he said, no, I don't want to put myself that forward. He was in the procession that followed the main group. And then Lincoln would encounter blacks when he walked back and forth to his office. And they would exchange greetings, even if they weren't particularly intimate. Nevertheless, so he lives in a multiracial world, has friends in that world, clients in that world, servants whom he treats with the utmost respect and kindness. And then he reads about other black people in Springfield. For example, Samuel Ball, who was a Baptist minister. And Samuel Ball went to Liberia on behalf of the Baptist Church in order to inspect conditions there to see whether there would be a suitable place for black people who despaired of ever getting a fair break and enjoying first-class citizenship. And so he goes, spends some time in Liberia, comes back, writes a little booklet, which was very widely read and discussed. And he was a very impressive fellow, and he was a barber. He was Flourville's main competitor. And then, apropos of colonization, the black residents of Springfield protested against colonization. Samuel Ball, to the contrary, notwithstanding. They said, look, we're Americans, we speak English, we're used to the climate and the conditions and the food and the germs of the United States. And so they protested colonization, showing that they were willing to stand up and not be just passive and acquiescent in the racial arrangements that were prominent in Illinois. And Illinois, by the way, was the most Negrophobic state in the Union, with a possible exception of Indiana. It was a close call. Both of those states passed laws in the early 1850s forbidding black people to move in. Not just the standard, you can't vote, you can't hold office, you can't intermarry with whites, you can't sit on juries, you can't even settle here, you can't move in. Which is a clear violation of the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the Constitution. And when Lincoln gives his inaugural address in 1861, one of the things he recommends is that the Fugitive Slave Law be amended, changed, so that it would be in compliance with the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the Constitution, which meant that he said black people should have the same rights in court to jury trials, counsel, appeal, and so forth. So he's really endorsing the idea of black citizenship. Now, so when he gets to Washington then, he interacts with a lot of black people, including the chief butler at the White House was William Slade. William Slade was a man of great dignity, but also very funny. He had a great sense of humor, and Lincoln became an intimate friend of his, at least according to his daughter, that they would sit and chat, and they would exchange jokes, and that Slade was a leader of the Washington black community. He helped found the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which was one of the most important black churches in Washington. And you can't help but imagine that Lincoln's interaction with William Slade helped shape his attitude toward black people in general. And then callers would come to the White House to ask for various favors. One of the first ones to come is in 1862, Bishop Daniel Payne, perhaps the best known black man in the country at that time, next to Frederick Douglass. And Payne then speaks with Lincoln about abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia. And then he writes an article in the paper talking about how Lincoln was so very kind and very receptive, and then did sign the bill abolishing slavery. Then the next day, Alexander Crummell, a black abolitionist who lived in Liberia, and who was a graduate of Queen's College, Cambridge, and who taught philosophy at Liberia University. So he really is meeting some very sophisticated, educated folks. And then these were people who called on Lincoln. They weren't invited. But then he starts to invite blacks to come to the White House. And in August of 1862, he invites 5 leaders of the black community of Washington to come and discuss congressional appropriations that gave him what is an equivalent of dollars today, millions of dollars, to help promote colonization. That is, that if black people wanted to leave the country, they would be able to do so, and the government would help finance that. And that is sometimes that meeting is interpreted to show that Lincoln was favoring something like ethnic cleansing, that he wanted to get rid of all black people. That's nonsense. But what Lincoln did do that day was to bring a shorthand reporter into the White House and took down all the words that Lincoln uttered about colonization. And he basically gave these 5 leaders a lecture. And then it appeared in the press. And what Lincoln was trying to do was speak not just to those 5 gentlemen, but to the audience in southern Pennsylvania, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, conservative areas, which dreaded the prospect of emancipation if it weren't coupled with colonization. Lincoln was told time and again by congressmen, senators, friends of his in Kentucky, our people will not accept emancipation unless it's coupled with colonization. So what Lincoln was doing was having a means of telling those folks through action that he was serious about colonization. Well, it never came to anything. And so it was a way to grease the skids for the Emancipation Proclamation. And then Lincoln then, in 1863, this is 62 and 63, time and again, people come to the White House, black people, to talk about black troops. Because as of January 1st, 1863, and the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks were allowed into the Army. And so Frederick Douglass comes, and Frederick Douglass had been busily recruiting blacks to join the Army, but he then reached a point where he said, I can't do this in good conscience anymore because black people are only getting half the pay of whites in the Army. And also they can't be promoted to officerships, no matter how good they are, and how valiant and how capable they are, they can rise no higher than sergeant. So Douglass comes to the White House to protest against that. And Lincoln treats him very kindly, and Douglass says, Lincoln was the only white man that he never knew who didn't make him feel self-conscious about his race. And Lincoln explained that, look, to get the bill through Congress, we had to make this concession, and we will make it right. We will fix that. Congress will eventually restore back pay to those who have been shortchanged, and that happened for almost all black troops. There was some exceptions, but not many. And then Frederick Douglass comes to the White House in the next year, 1864, and he comes at the invitation of Lincoln. And Lincoln says, I think I'm going to lose my re-election bid. The signs are very negative. And it looks as though a Democrat is going to win the election. We don't even know who it is yet. They haven't held their convention. But whoever it is will not prosecute the war to a successful conclusion. The day that he is inaugurated, On March 4th, 1865, the war comes to an end, and all the slaves who have made it to our lines are free, and all the slaves who didn't are going to remain slaves. So Douglas, I want you to encourage black people, the slaves in the South who have not yet reached our lines, to do so. So organize a group of scouts who would go out, penetrate through Confederate lines, go to black people, encourage them, run away, because you may not be liberated unless you're in Union lines by next March. And Douglas says, sure, and he goes and he crafts a plan and submits it to the president. But between the time that he meets with Lincoln and the time that the plan is submitted, the military tide had turned, and Lincoln was convinced that he would win re-election, so it wasn't necessary to implement this policy. But the fact that he would invite Douglas to the White House, give him such an important assignment, I think speaks volumes. And then on top of that, Abraham Lincoln invites Frederick Douglass to tea at the summer White House. In those days, the Lincolns spent the warmer months at the Soldiers' Home in Washington. Any of you ever been there to the Soldiers' Home? Well, I see one hand, or two hands. I encourage you to do so. It's about 3 miles north of the White House, and it's elevated, so if there was any breeze in Washington, and having grown up in Washington a little later than this period, but not much, the heat and the humidity of summers in Washington is pretty formidable. And so Lincoln invites Douglas to tea. So this is a social event. This is not a business event. And Douglas turns him down because he's got a speaking engagement that night. And he says, I never break my commitment to speak. And then he later regretted that he hadn't made an exception on that occasion. And then another example of what blacks coming to the White House is at White House receptions. Now, frequently the reception that Douglas tried to attend right after the second inauguration on March 4th, 1865, when Douglas was refused admission. This is a fairly famous story. And he said to a passing friend, go tell the president that I'm being denied admittance. And the word came right back, let him in. And so Douglas walks in and he sees this huge receiving line, and he starts to go into it. He said, no, Douglas, you don't have to get in line. There's no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours. What did you think of my speech at my second inaugural? And I sometimes fantasize that Douglas might have said, well, Mr. President, I thought your syntax was a little garbled in that penultimate paragraph, and I thought the image that you used from the Bible wasn't really apposite. But no, he said it was a sacred effort, Mr. Lincoln. But that was not the first time that a black person had called come to a White House reception. There were at least 4 occasions earlier when black people were admitted to the White House receptions. And every time that happened, it was written up in newspapers, and every time that happened and was reported, the Democrats went ballistic. And it's well known to students of American history that when Theodore Roosevelt was president, he created a firestorm by inviting a black man to dinner. That was Booker T. Washington. What is not well known is that every time Lincoln was kind and courteous to black people, for example, at White House receptions, or in interviews that then get written up in the papers, the Democrats go ballistic. And so all these events, which are chronicled in this book, I think lend credence to the notion that Lincoln was instinctively a racial egalitarian. And his instinctive egalitarian sentiment led him to take a fatal step. On the 11th of April, 1865, Lincoln gave his last public speech, which of course he didn't know was going to be his last speech. And in that, his egalitarian sense transformed itself not just into courtesy and kindness and receptivity to black appeals, but to a policy matter. That is, he had been visited in March of 1864 by 2 gentlemen from New Orleans, 2 black men who brought a petition. And the petition was signed by 1,000 black men in New Orleans. And they said, look, we're taxpayers, we're educated, we're literate, and we would like to vote. And Lincoln tells them, well, I'm very sympathetic, but eligibility for voting is defined by the states and not by the federal government. But I'm very sympathetic. And then, a few days later, he writes to the governor of of Louisiana, and says, you're about to hold a constitutional convention. I would like that new constitution to include voting rights for blacks, at least those who served in the Army and Navy, and those who are very intelligent, by which we assume he meant literate. And then on April 11th, 1865, he goes public with that recommendation. He says, I believe that black people in Louisiana should be allowed to vote, at least those who are veterans of the military and who are very intelligent. And Frederick Douglass later said that that is Frederick Douglass, and my friends, my abolitionist friends, were very disappointed because of the limited scope of that recommendation. Just the veterans of the Army and the very intelligent. But we should have recognized that that was a really important speech, because Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge, and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. And having done that, you then take a large hammer, a maul, and you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And what we should have known on April 11th was that's what Lincoln was doing. He was inserting the thin edge of the wedge. And once he had done that publicly, you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge. It's a brilliant image, and it really fits the way Lincoln dealt with slavery, for example. So Frederick Douglass bemoaned the fact that he failed to appreciate the significance of that speech, but there was a member of the audience, a big audience outside the White House. There was a young man in the audience who did appreciate how important that speech was, and that was a charismatic young actor named John Wilkes Booth. And when he heard Lincoln endorse, for the first time, publicly, black voting rights, he turned to his companions and he said, that means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he's ever going to give. By God, I'm going to run him through. And 3 days later, he murdered Lincoln, not because Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which is here in my tie, not because he's facilitated the passage of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery not just in the Confederacy, but throughout the nation. He murdered Lincoln because he called for black voting rights. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for us in the 21st century to regard Abraham Lincoln as a martyr to black civil rights as much as Martin Luther King, or Medgar Evers, or Viola Liuzzo, or James Reeb, or Mickey Schwerner, or Andrew Goodman, or James Chaney, or any of those people who were murdered in the 1960s as they championed the civil rights revolution of that era. So on that note, I conclude my remarks, and I welcome your comments, questions.